This is part 2 of the Hall of Records from the Neverhood, published by Dreamworks Interactive. Ogdilla. Quater made Ogdilla as a kind of test subject. He gave Ogdilla a crown, although he did not have a head to set the crown on. Ogdilla is a massive blue gas that is barely self-aware. It is said that Ogdilla is the spirit of adventure, since on the day he was made, he left Quater's homeland traveling in a straight line without stopping. He has picked up many particles from space, which have made a happy home for themselves on Ogdilla's back. Ogdilla is now 1,000,000 times the size he was when Quater made him, and his inhabitants include the specks of Rillanet. The specks of Rillanet were in constant conflict with the specks of Rod. The specks of Rod cultivated food on Ogdilla's back using their own spit. The specks of Rillanet had no spit, but occupied most of the surface of Ogdilla. The specks of Rillanet were disgusted by the spitting that the specks of Rod did, and they did not like stepping in it either. The strife between the specks of Rillanet and the specks of Rod carried on for centuries. The conflict was never physically violent, but there was much whining, taunting, heated sneering, upheavals, and so on. This period is known as the Ubla-Sancter-Hacht, or the 3 millennia of conflict, although it was really more like 2.5. During the Ubla-Sancter-Hacht, an incident happened that at once made all the specks forget their animosity, and at the same time exacerbated the conflict even more. In the 8th month on the 27th day, during the 11th year of the 1st century of the 2nd millennium of the Ubla-Sancter-Hacht, the specks of Rillanet woke up to find a strange being of gigantic size asleep in Scrunchy Park. There was a pond by his head where he had ruled while he slept. A crowd of specks gathered around the Titan as the morning hours went by. The larger the crowd grew, the more the specks talked among themselves. The hubbub finally became so loud that the giant awoke and sat up. The giant showed his great teeth and growled at them from deep within his huge body. The specks fed him for fear of being eaten alive. The giant could easily have thrown 3 or 4 of them into his mouth at once. He was very bizarre looking, even for a giant. He was like nothing they had ever seen before. His head had a ring of flesh on it that started almost at the very top, then looped down and joined the head again at the jaw. 3 specks, one on top of the other, could have stood up inside the ring. He had huge lips, with which he covered his enormous teeth, while the specks had no lips at all. Above the lips, almost to the top of the face, were 2 bowl-shaped things that had 1 dot within each of them. The giant seemed to use them to observe things, since the dots moved and pointed at whoever was speaking to him. His torso was short for his size, while his legs were extremely long. Out of his chest stuck 3 spiked horns. For days upon end, the specks tried to speak to the giant to find out if he was friend or foe, to no avail. His form of speech sounded too low down, deep and loud. It reminded them too much of the rumbling growl that came from deep within his body. The specks did not like it, and they did not understand it. They could not even tell where one syllable ended and the next began. And comprehending sentences was totally impossible. To avoid hearing him speak, the specks fed him constantly. The specks of Rillanet did not keep a guard posted where the giant was staying. They could never have overpowered him. In any case, the giant never threatened them. King Rillanet had in mind to win over the giant's confidence so that he might be employed to stomp on the specks of Rod. King Rillanet often went to Scrunchy Park to speak to the giant. He wanted to impress the giant so that he had the best acrobats from the Rillanet circus come visit him. The king commanded a unicyclist to do loop-de-loops inside the ring on the giant's head, while a high diver did trick dives of his huge lips into a barrel of water at the giant's feet. During these demonstrations of the circus performer's expertise, the giant did nothing but stand still and smile. Even while there were trapeze artists swinging from the 3 spikes that stuck out from his chest, the giant stood like a stone sculpture with a silly grin on his face. King Rillanut redoubled his efforts to continue to try to communicate with the giant once he saw that the giant would not harm the circus performers as they climbed and swung upon his body. Day after day, the king came out to where the giant was to try again to communicate his desire for the giant to walk over and stomp on the specks of Rod. The giant smiled a lot at the king. He nodded his head when the king nodded his head. He shook his head when the king shook his head. When King Rillanut slapped his own forehead, the giant slapped his own forehead. When the king mimed walking and pointed in the direction of the kingdom of Rod, the giant stood up and did a dance. King Rillanut was furious. While the giant was still dancing, the king ordered all of the specks of Rillanut to throw things at him. Since they were feeding the giant all the time, the only stuff they had at hand was food, so they threw that at him. The giant tried to eat as much of the food thrown at him as possible, but he could not keep up with the furious pace with which the specks were throwing it at him. He turned and walked away from them and headed in the direction of the kingdom of Rod. So the specks of Rillanut had a great celebration. They hoped that as soon as the giant arrived in the kingdom of Rod, he would smoosh the specks of Rod, who were such a bother to the kingdom of Rillanut. King Rillanut gave a rousing speech. "Well, that's that for a great giant. I suppose we owe a debt of thanks to the goofy Colossus, for he will shortly be stepping on the specks of Rod and making so much mush of them. His immense foot will crush our ancient foe in an instant. Squashed beneath his mammoth bulk, those unspeakable wretches will be reduced to the vile scum that they have always represented. We are now delivered forever from their constant whining, taunting, and hectoring. That feeble-minded Titan is our national hero. A doltish whopper, he shall be the greatest of all figures in the history of Rillanut. There is none equal to his block-headed enormity on all of Ogdilla, but he did finally come through for us. A stupendously dumb gargantua, it is well nevertheless that we are rid of him. And I suppose we ought to be thankful that the half-witted behemoth did not stomp on us too. I cannot think of any reason why he would come back here. Can you?" This was part 2 of the Hall of Records from the Neverhood. The Hall of Records was written by Dr. Naple, Mark Lorenzen, and Dale Lawrence. This reading of the Hall of Records was done by Old Nile.